Every wartime photograph was a decision. Military censors reviewed thousands of images from the front, selecting what the public would see and what it would not. The weapons were approved, the victories were approved, but certain items visible on soldiers in the field, ordinary, uncomfortable, sometimes desperate pieces of equipment were quietly passed over. They did not support the narrative of strength, readiness, or national resolve. They told a different story, one of shortage, fear, improvisation, and discipline that no propaganda office wanted to explain. These are 10 field gear items that were present in the war, carried openly by soldiers across every front, but rarely centered in the imagery that shaped how the world chose to remember it. Number 10. German trench periscopes. Seeing without standing on the Eastern Front and across the defensive lines of occupied Europe, German infantrymen used trench periscopes to observe enemy positions without exposing their heads above the parapet. The devices were standard issue in static defensive sectors, distributed to frontline units holding fortified positions where movement above ground level invited immediate death from snipers and directed fire. The construction was straightforward. Two angled mirrors mounted inside a metal or wooden frame allowed a soldier to see over an obstruction while remaining below the line of sight. Some were manufactured to specification. Others were improvised from salvaged materials when supply chains failed to deliver replacements. The quality varied enormously depending on the theater, the unit, and the stage of the war. Trench periscopes were rarely featured in official wartime photography for a reason that had nothing to do with secrecy. They were associated with static defense, with soldiers pinned in position, unable to advance, forced to observe rather than act. This was the opposite of the imagery that German propaganda required. The Wehrmacht's public narrative demanded movement, aggression, and dominance. A soldier crouching in a trench, peering through a mirror because standing meant death, contradicted that narrative entirely. Archival photographs confirm their widespread use. They appear in field images from Stalingrad, from the Normandy Bocage, from the grinding attritional sectors of Italy. Yet they were almost never the subject of the photograph. They were background details, visible but unemphasized, present but never promoted. Distribution was broad in defensive sectors, but inconsistent elsewhere. Units on the move or in fluid combat rarely carried them. Their presence in the photographic record is a quiet indicator of something armies preferred not to advertise. That much of the war was spent not attacking, but waiting and watching from positions where standing upright could be fatal. The trench periscope was not hidden. It was simply never worth celebrating. And that distinction reveals more about wartime image-making than any classified document. Number 9. Improvised helmet camouflage. The disappearance of uniformity across every front. Soldiers modified their helmets with whatever materials were available: mud, netting, foliage, strips of cloth, burlap, and scavenged fabric. The practice was universal. American, British, German, and Soviet troops all adapted their headgear to break up the distinctive silhouette that factory-finished helmets presented to enemy observers. Standard issue helmets were designed for protection, not concealment. Their smooth, curved surfaces reflected light and created recognizable outlines at distance. In the field, soldiers discovered quickly that an unmodified helmet could draw fire as effectively as a signal flare. The response was immediate and unauthorized. Men wrapped their helmets in whatever disrupted the shape: chicken wire stuffed with grass, strips of Hessen tied with cord, mud smeared across the surface and left to dry. Some armies eventually issued camouflage covers as standard equipment. Others never did. In units where covers were unavailable, improvisation became the norm. The results were effective but visually chaotic. A platoon of soldiers wearing identical uniforms but carrying helmets wrapped in mismatched rags. Vegetation and salvaged material presented an image that no recruiting poster could use. Official photography rarely centered on these modifications. The visual disorder they created undermined the appearance of discipline, standardization, and professional military bearing that wartime imagery was designed to project. A soldier with foliage stuffed into netting over his helmet looked like what he was: a man adapting to survive in conditions his equipment was not fully designed for. That reality was uncomfortable for institutions invested in projecting readiness and control. The practice was common enough to be effectively universal in combat zones. It was not forbidden, but neither was it encouraged in any visual medium intended for public consumption. Improvised helmet camouflage was a survival adaptation that existed in tension with the institutional desire for uniformity, and uniformity in wartime imagery was always the priority. Number 8. USD. Day gas detection, brassards the sleeves that warned of gas. When American soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, many wore chemically treated armbands on their sleeves. These were M5 gas detection brassards, fabric strips impregnated with chemicals designed to change color in the presence of blister agents such as mustard gas. The brassards were standard issue for the invasion force. Allied intelligence could not confirm whether German forces would deploy chemical weapons during the defense of the Atlantic Wall. The decision was made to equip assault troops with detection equipment as a precaution. The brassards were worn on the upper arm, visible and accessible, allowing soldiers and medics to identify chemical exposure quickly in the chaos of an amphibious assault. The construction was simple: treated cloth sewn or pinned to the uniform sleeve reactive to specific chemical compounds. They required no training to read. A color change meant contamination. The absence of change meant nothing, or it meant the agent was something the brassard could not detect. These armbands appear in archival photographs from the D-Day landings. They are visible on soldiers waiting ashore, crouching behind obstacles, and moving inland through the first hours of the invasion. But they were rarely highlighted in official accounts or post-war documentaries. The reason was straightforward. The brassards represented a fear that never materialized. Chemical-sized weapons were not used at Normandy. Drawing attention to the gas detection equipment meant drawing attention to the possibility that the invasion could have been far worse. A narrative that complicated the story of IPAO's Allied triumph rather than supporting it. Their distribution was extensive within the D-Day assault force but limited beyond it. As the campaign moved inland and the chemical threat diminished, the brassards were discarded or forgotten. They remain one of the most visible yet least discussed items of equipment from the most photographed military operation in history. If you had landed on Omaha Beach wearing a chemical detection patch, knowing gas could have been used at any moment, would you have wanted that possibility publicly discussed or kept quiet to protect morale? Be honest. Number 7. British anti-gas capes, prepared for a war that never came. British soldiers throughout the war carried anti-gas capes, lightweight rubberized fabric covers designed to be thrown over the body in the event of a chemical attack. The capes were issued alongside respirators and were part of the standard chemical defense kit carried by infantry in every theater from 1939 onward. The cape itself was a simple piece of treated fabric folded into a compact pouch and carried on the webbing or in the pack. When deployed, it draped over the soldier's body, providing a temporary barrier against liquid, chemical agents settling on skin and clothing. It was not a permanent protection. It was a delay, buying time to reach decontamination or to move out of the affected area. The anti-gas cape was seldom featured in wartime imagery because it represented preparation for a horror that the public did not want to contemplate. The memory of chemical warfare in the First World War remained vivid. Governments on both sides understood that any suggestion of imminent gas warfare would provoke panic, disproportionate to the actual threat. Photographs of soldiers carrying or wearing anti-gas equipment reminded viewers that the chemical threshold could be crossed at any moment, a message no propaganda office wished to amplify. The capes were carried faithfully in the early years of the war when the threat of German chemical attack was considered credible. As the conflict progressed and chemical weapons remained unused on the Western Front, soldiers increasingly viewed the capes as dead weight. Many were discarded, repurposed as ground sheets, or used as rain protection, a practical adaptation that quietly acknowledged the gap between official preparedness and battlefield reality. The anti-gas cape was never classified. It was simply an object that reminded everyone of a possibility too terrible to promote. And so it was carried in silence, present in thousands of photographs, but almost never discussed. Number 6, captured enemy, boots and webbing, wearing the other side. In prolonged campaigns where supply lines stretched thin or collapsed entirely. Soldiers wore captured enemy equipment. This was documented across every front. American troops in the Ardennes wore German boots when their own footwear disintegrated in the winter cold. Soviet soldiers used captured German webbing, belts, and load-carrying equipment when their own supplies failed to arrive. German troops on the Eastern Front stripped Soviet dead of felt boots, quilted jackets, and any cold weather gear that offered better protection than what Berlin had provided. The practice was driven entirely by necessity. Captured boots were not trophies. They were functional equipment taken because the alternative was frostbite, immobility, or death. Webbing and load-carrying gear was adopted because it worked and because the soldiers' own equipment had been destroyed, lost, or never issued in sufficient quantity. The risks were significant. Wearing enemy equipment created identification problems identical to those associated with captured weapons. A soldier in German boots could be mistaken for the enemy by his own side. At night, in poor visibility, or during the confusion of a counterattack, the wrong silhouette or the wrong equipment profile could draw friendly fire. Officers warned against the practice. Regulations in most armies discouraged it. Regulations did not keep feet warm. Official imagery almost never depicted soldiers wearing captured enemy gear. The reasons were institutional rather than operational. A photograph of an Allied soldier wearing German boots was an admission that supply had failed, that the army could not equip its own men adequately. For German forces, the sight of Wehrmacht soldiers wearing Soviet felt boots contradicted the narrative of technological and logistical superiority that the regime demanded. The practice was common, well documented in personal accounts and unit histories, and almost entirely absent from the visual record that shaped public understanding of the war. It remains one of the clearest examples of how ordinary field necessity disappeared from official narratives because it told a story no institution wanted to tell. What the WWII's first 5 entries reveal is a pattern that extends beyond any single army or front. Field gear often reflects not what militaries wanted to project, but what they struggled to control. The items carried by soldiers in combat told stories of shortage, improvisation, and unspoken fears that ran counter to the imagery carefully curated for domestic audiences. Camouflage was improvised because issue equipment fell short. Chemical detection gear was carried for a threat that haunted planners but never materialized. Enemy boots were worn because supply systems broke under the weight of total war. None of this was secret, none of it was classified, but none of it was featured because the gap between institutional messaging and battlefield reality was something no wartime photograph was supposed to close. The remaining entries on this list carry that pattern further into territory where discomfort becomes something harder to discuss, where gear was not merely overlooked, but actively kept from view because of what it said about the systems behind it. Do you believe wartime governments have a responsibility to show the uncomfortable realities of war, or is selective imagery necessary to maintain national unity? I want your answer in the comments. Number 5. Improvised Eastern Front winter insulation. Straw in the boots. During the first winter of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Wehrmacht soldiers stuffed their boots with straw, newspaper, and torn fabric in an attempt to prevent frostbite. The practice was not issued guidance. It was desperation made visible, a direct consequence of the catastrophic failure to supply winter equipment to frontline troops before temperatures plunged below 30 degrees. The insulation materials were scavenged from whatever was available. Straw pulled from barns and farmhouses, pages torn from books, manuals, and letters, strips of cloth cut from blankets, captured uniforms, and civilian clothing taken from abandoned homes. Soldiers wrapped their feet in layers of improvised material, then forced their boots back on over the bulk, creating a crude thermal barrier that offered marginal protection against conditions their footwear was never designed to withstand. The German military command did not want this photographed. Images of soldiers stuffing straw into their boots were direct evidence of a planning failure so severe it bordered on criminal negligence. The Wehrmacht had launched Operation Barber, Rosa, without adequate cold weather provisions for millions of men. The assumption that the campaign would be concluded before winter proved catastrophically wrong, and the men on the front paid the price with frostbite, amputation, and death. Photographs exist. Field images from the winter of 1941 and 1942 show soldiers with visibly bulging boots, wrapped feet, and makeshift insulation protruding from footwear. But these images were not released through official channels. They contradicted the narrative of German military efficiency and logistical superiority that the regime required. The practice was not limited to German forces. Soviet soldiers in poorly supplied units used similar methods. The difference was that the Soviet experience of winter was expected and to some degree planned for. For the Wehrmacht, straw in the boots was an indictment, visible proof of institutional failure, and an image the leadership could not afford to let the public see. Number 4. German Zeltbahn Shelter Quarter. The tent that became a uniform. The Zeltbahn was a standard-issue triangular shelter quarter carried by German infantry throughout the war. Designed to be combined with 3 other identical pieces to form a 4-man tent, it was one of the most versatile items in the Wehrmacht field kit. It was also one of the most visually uncontrolled. Constructed from waterproofed cotton or later war synthetic fabric, the Zeltbahn featured a splinter camouflage pattern on one side and a darker, often earth-toned color on the reverse. Soldiers used it as a rain cape, a ground sheet, a stretcher, a camouflage cover, a windbreak, and in the most desperate circumstances, as supplementary clothing when uniforms deteriorated beyond repair. The problem for wartime imagery was not the Zeltbahn itself, but what soldiers did with it. Photographs from the Eastern Front and the Italian campaign showed German troops wearing Zeltbohnen as ponchos, wrapping them around their bodies for warmth, or draping them over equipment in configurations that bore no resemblance to the crisp, standardized appearance that military photography preferred. A soldier wrapped in a shelter quarter looked like a refugee, not a warrior. The visual impression was one of endurance and hardship rather than strength and order. The Zeltbahn was issued to virtually every German infantryman and appeared in countless field photographs, but its depiction in official imagery was carefully managed. Clean, properly configured shelter halves assembled into regulation tents were acceptable. Soldiers wrapped in them like blankets, trudging through mud or snow were not. It was standard equipment used in ways that standard imagery could not accommodate. A piece of gear so ordinary that its misuse revealed extraordinary conditions and so ubiquitous that hiding it entirely was impossible. The Zeltbahn was everywhere. What soldiers did with it was something else. Number 3. Military. Police field restraint equipment. Discipline in the field. Every major army deployed military police units with the authority and equipment to detain, restrain, and process soldiers accused of offenses ranging from desertion to cowardice to looting. The equipment they carried included handcuffs, restraint cords, field detention stakes, and, in some armies, leg irons designed for securing prisoners during transport. This equipment was standard issue for military police and provost units. It was manufactured to specification, distributed through official channels, and used in accordance with military law. Its existence was neither secret nor unusual. Every army that fielded millions of men required systems for maintaining discipline, and those systems required physical tools. But the imagery of soldiers being restrained by their own military police was almost never released for public consumption. The reasons were obvious. Photographs of Allied or Axis soldiers in handcuffs undermined the narrative of willing unified fighting forces bound by shared purpose. Images of field detention, men staked to the ground or chained during transport, suggested that armies maintained order through coercion rather than morale. Neither message served the interests of any wartime government. Documented cases confirm that restraint equipment was used across all theaters. Military police records describe the detention and processing of thousands of soldiers for disciplinary offenses during the war. The equipment was functional, unremarkable, and routinely employed. Its absence from the photographic record is not evidence of suppression, but of editorial judgment, a collective understanding that some realities of military life were best left unillustrated. Field restraint equipment reveals the institutional machinery that operated beneath the surface of every army. It was the gear that enforced obedience when obedience failed, and its quiet omission from wartime imagery tells us as much about what nations wanted to believe about their soldiers as any medal or flag. Number 2. Soviet Strathbot identification markings marked for redemption. The Soviet Union operated penal military units, Strathbats for officers and Strathniks for enlisted men throughout the war. These were punishment battalions composed of soldiers convicted of military offenses, including desertion, cowardice, insubordination, and criminal conduct. Assignment was a sentence. Service was expected to be redeemed through combat, often in the most dangerous sectors of the front. Soldiers assigned to Strathbot units were documented with specific administrative markings on their personnel. Files and in some documented cases carried identification that distinguished them from regular troops. The nature of these markings varied. Some units used distinctive A&D document stamps. Others employed physical markers on equipment or clothing to identify penal personnel to supervisory officers and blocking detachments positioned behind them. Soviet wartime photography never depicted Strathbat markings or the units that carried them. The existence of penal battalions was not publicly acknowledged during the war. The Soviet narrative required that every soldier fought willingly for the motherland. The idea that hundreds of thousands of men served under sentence, driven forward by the threat of execution from behind as much as by the enemy ahead, was incompatible with that narrative. Post-war Soviet historiography continued to minimize the role of penal units for decades. Only after the dissolution of the Soviet Union did archival records confirm the scale of the system. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers passed through Strathbat units during the war. Casualty rates were extreme. The markings they carried were administrative tools of a system designed to convert punishment into expendable manpower. The Strathbat identification markings were not field gear in the conventional sense. They were the visible edge of a disciplinary apparatus that armies rarely discuss. A system where a man's equipment marked him not as a soldier, but as someone whose survival was considered secondary to the tactical objective he was ordered to achieve. Number 1. German. Strafbataillon insignia punishment on display. Germany also operated punishment battalion Strafbataillon throughout the war. These units were composed of soldiers convicted by military courts of offenses ranging from desertion and insubordination to cowardice and political unreliability. Like their Soviet counterparts, German penal soldiers were assigned to the most hazardous duties available with the understanding that their sentence would be served through combat or not at all. What distinguished the German system was the degree to which punishment was made visible. Soldiers assigned to Strathbatai were in documented cases stripped of rank insignia and issued equipment that identified them as penal personnel. Some units required the removal of all decorations. Others issued modified identity documents that marked the bearer as serving under sentence. In certain formations, penal soldiers wore distinctive armbands or carried documentation that ensured every officer they encountered understood their status immediately. This visibility served a deliberate purpose. The German military command used the Strathbatei system not only as punishment, but as deterrent. The knowledge that convicted soldiers would be visibly marked, stripped of status, and assigned to near-suicidal operations was intended to discourage the offenses that led to assignment. The insignia, or rather the absence of insignia, was the punishment made physical. Wartime photography never centered on strabai on personnel or their ad markings. The existence of the system was known within the military, but was not material that propaganda officers chose to feature. Images of German soldiers stripped of rank, marked as convicts, and sent to die in clearing operations or mine-sweeping duties contradicted the narrative of the Wehrmacht as a professional, disciplined fighting force united by duty and honor. The reality was more complicated. Some Strathbatei soldiers had committed genuine criminal offenses. Others had been convicted for questioning orders, expressing doubt, or simply being in the wrong place when an example was needed. The German Strathbatei insignia sits at the top of this list because it represents the most uncomfortable intersection of field equipment and institutional power. It was not hidden because it was shameful to the individual. It was hidden because it was shameful to the system. A visible admission that armies maintained order not only through leadership and shared purpose, but through fear, coercion, and the public marking of men deemed expendable. If an army has to publicly mark its own soldiers as expendable, is that discipline or something else? Where do you draw that line? Wars are remembered through the images that survive them, and those images are never accidental. What was photographed? what was approved, and what was allowed to represent the experience of millions was always a choice. The field gear on this list was not secret. It was not classified. It was carried openly by soldiers on every front of the Second World War, but it was rarely the subject of the photograph, rarely the focus of the caption, and almost never the image that made it into the documentary or the history book. These were the items that told harder stories of shortage, fear, improvisation, punishment, and the institutional machinery that operated behind the narratives of courage and sacrifice. Total war does not only reshape nations and armies, it reshapes everything a soldier carries down to the smallest, most ordinary object in his pack, and everything a nation chooses to remember about what he carried when the fighting was done.